This is the video on disadvantages of aquaculture to follow up the advantages. So we'll start with ethics. Ethics is a possible concern. Some people are very concerned with the way factory farming is done with pigs and chickens, most notably, and it'd be hard to argue with the fact that there's a lot of cruelty in those practices, and it may be that fish farming is really no better. It's really about allowing these animals to express their natural tendencies, and you could argue that a fish farm is not really a allowing those animals to live in a very free, happy manner. And we do find that there's a lot of stress in fish farming. Okay, but you'll get a lot of better result with your aquaculture if you can keep stress down in those organisms. Another one, privatization of coastline slash aesthetic values. So, in terms of aesthetics, a lot of perhaps if you can imagine that you had a house overlooking this point, you might not want to have a whole heap of sea pens and noise and running around of large boats coming from an area that was once a very pristine, beautiful view. Or you may consider that this was, or perhaps this was a ski lane or a area that that was once able to be dived by the public for crayfish, or people often fished there. Now, once you have these sea pens, it may be that you're excluding others from using it. So you've taken what was a publicly owned space and privatized it. In the Coromandel region, the mussel farms are actually considered quite a good place to go fishing now. So that hasn't been an issue. But it does stop other people from using this resource. It's a consumptive use of resources. Disease, bacteria, and parasites. So what happens when you have a whole lot of people in a small enclosed area? Generally, if one person is sick, it'll go through it. Kindergarten is a prime example of that, or even here at Tech. One person gets the flu, everybody gets the flu. Well, in order to combat that, chemicals such as chlorine, formaldehyde, copper salts, antibiotics, pesticides are often added to the water. And these organisms that attack fish, like parasites, which are very common in the wild. Most organisms have parasites, and humans, up till 100 years ago or so, were riddled with parasites, just like the rest of the animal kingdom. These ones are sea lice, and it's very easy for them to spread from one to the next. It's just like nits in a kindergarten class or a primary school class again. So they spread from one to the next very easily. Now, what happens is, because you've artificially increased the density of these organisms, then the parasites can become artificially high in population, and then the wild populations of salmon, perhaps, that swim by these things, especially the juveniles, get attacked by way more parasitic offspring than there normally would be. And so parasites become a problem not only for the farmed animals but also for the wild stock. There is some interesting work that Simon Muncaster did on introducing cleaner wrasse to the cages in order to control these things. So there may be natural solutions. And again, with all of these disadvantages of aquaculture, there are actually problems to be solved rather than insurmountable obstacles. So you can do things like vaccinate the fish, but then again, it's expensive and labor intensive. Fecal deposits and antibiotics from food sources come as a disadvantage. So if you keep fish in an enclosed pen and you feed them very high protein food because you want a lot of growth, because the faster they grow, the faster you can harvest them, and the faster you turn over your stock, the more money you could make. But if you add 10 tons of food, some of it in pellets, some of it isn't going to get eaten. They're just going to miss it. Some of it will sink out of the cage, and a lot of it will sink to the seabed, including the waste, essentially the poos from those organisms, and a lot of them will just be broken up and dissolve, and those ones will, and also there's essentially the wheeze from the fish, and these nutrients get dissolved in the water, and the nutrients then can fuel the growth of algae. And you've probably heard the term eutrophication, in which you get a lot of nutrients going into the water. You feed the growth of algal blooms, and these things, some of them can have consequences, because some of these little phytoplankton will have chemical defenses, and these things can lead to instances of paralytic shellfish poisoning and other irritations for swimmers and the like. There's little government support. Okay, so the aquaculture industry and the fishing industry are both supposed to self-fund the regulation with levies. All right. Now, but if you look at the farming industry, there are whole government-supported, taxpayer-supported research organizations that are there simply to provide information to farmers and improve ways to support farming and gain productions. Now, of course, that doesn't happen in the aquaculture industry, so the expense is borne on, or the expense is borne by the individual owners. So, for example, the Pawa farm in near Ruakaka at Bream Bay, they have changed their settling tanks 3 times with enormous expense. They've had to figure out how to settle the larvae of the Pawa and grow them out and figure out what benthic diatoms and other organisms the Pawa are most likely to feed on and thrive on. And that all took a lot of time, a lot of money, and without some very deep-pocketed supporters, that would not have occurred. There are bureaucratic and legal problems as well. So with the current RMA, the Resource Management Act, you can expect to spend $1 million plus in order to just get your farm off the ground, just going through the consultation process and legal framework, negotiating the way through the legal framework of the RMA, just to get consent in order to start your fish farm. In other parts of the world, salmon, this is the salmon fluke that we were talking about, devastated wild populations, and also farmed salmon that are bred. They've had selective breeding, so you choose the fastest growing ones, because that's what you want for your production. In order to increase your production, you want fast growing fish, but those ones may not be able to be the best at surviving in the wild. Okay, so if they go and they escape and then they breed with wild salmon, they may actually be breeding out the characteristics, the traits that allowed those wild salmon to be good at surviving. And so you'll have a less fit offspring. In New Zealand, we don't farm salmon or there are no wild salmon populations, so there's no disease, and so we don't have to use antibiotics or vaccines. But we do feed them from Chilean and Peruvian anchovetas, so that's anchovies, also some sardines, And generally, those fish are caught and just ground up into fish meal fish for feeding to these salmon. So we could go ahead and eat the anchovies and sardines, and those are very healthy fish, beautiful, full of omega threes, and you could wind up, instead of feeding 2 to 4 kilos of fish meal to grow 1 kilo of salmon, you could just have the 2 to 4 kilos of fish meal of anchovies and sardines, and that may be a more um, efficient use of the resource, especially since there are hungry people in the world. So review, you can go back through the individual advantages and problems with aquaculture and be able to list those and describe them for the exam.